Is Sinn Fein in government, an issue which is obviously quite relevant to those who are active on the left at the moment in the south, and an issue which we've had to deal with quite for a number of years now in the north. Our speaker is Grady Horgan. Grady's a leading member of the SWP from Derry, and she's a trade union activist. She's been centrally involved in building groups like People Before Profit in the north, and very active at the moment in our union and fighting back against cutbacks in the University of Ulster. Again, an issue which is none too disconnected from this topic. So Grady's going to speak for about 30-35 minutes, and you know, like same format as every meeting, we'll open up the floor and hopefully have a bit of discussion. So thanks very much. I'll hand over to Grady.
Okay, thanks. I guess it's still morning. Good morning. I mean, there's a lot of interest here in the south these days about Sinn Féin and you know how it's been in government, and it's kind of interesting really to see how there is all of a sudden this interest, because it looks like they may be in government down here. But actually, if you look at the Irish Marxist Review, the very first volume, the very first one that was published in 2012, had an article in it about Sinn Féin in government by Sean McVeigh. And it's actually worth going back and having a look at that, because if you listen to people talking about what's happening in the north at the minute, like with the talks, for example, that are going on, the message that's being given out by Sinn Féin is that the crisis talks that are going on, you know, that turnabout that there's been has come about because Sinn Féin will not implement austerity, and you know, something had gone wrong, and therefore the institutions, you know, they went into crisis, etc., and that's why there's the current crisis. But actually, if you go back and read that article from 2012, you actually start to see that you can go right back to the month after Sinn Féin went into became the second largest party in the north and went into government with Ian Paisley Senior. So literally, if you remember, it was the end of 2007 that the deal got made, where Paisley and McGuinness became the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister. And from the day after that, when they actually sat down to look at what the programme for government would be and what the budget would be, Sinn Féin agreed, so this is like, say, the end of 2007, start of 2008, they agreed 3% year-on-year cuts across the entire public sector. Now 3% year-on-year cuts means, like, if you started with £100, you'll have £97 this year, next year you'll only have 94, and so on, it goes on like less and less and less. So those kind of massive cuts to the public sector have actually been going on under Sinn Féin in government since 2008. So just speeded up really since you had the coalition government coming into power then in England. But actually, even under Labour, before the cuts had actually begun, even before the economic crisis had started, they'd started on the cuts. And in a little while, I'll actually go back a bit further, because if you look at the first mandate, straight after the Good Friday Agreement, the first round of the executive, when Sinn Féin wasn't wasn't one of the leading parties in government, but held the health ministry and held the education ministry. And when you go back and you look then at what was happening in 2000 and 2001, it's absolutely horrific to look at the extent to which their ministers were the most, the best cheerleaders really for the kind of neoliberal policies that are kind of coming home to roost now. And the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems that's faced in the north at the minute by the public funds is this massive debt that the public now owe, or we now owe, to private finance initiative bills. So before any other money is spent by the government in the north, they have to find about £400 million every year just to pay back various PFI, private finance initiative investments. Where do they come from? If you actually look, the private finance initiative really had died by about 2009 or so, because the figures were coming in from England to make it clear that actually they were a complete disaster for the public purse and that they were costing far, far more than anybody had expected that they would. And when you go and you look at where most of those ones in the north came from, they came from the two departments that Sinn Féin ran. Martin McGuinness in particular, as the Education Minister, signed off on the largest load of PFI contracts. So you're talking about back in 2002, 2001, 2002, long before they were in the position that they are now, you know, where they can now kind of say, well, you know, we're in government with DUP and everything, we have to do this. They actually chose, and in fact Martin McGuinness lauded the whole idea of PFI and said that this is a really good way for us to build new schools, etc. The result of that has been that we have, for example, Balmoral High School in Belfast, which now lies empty, but which costs the taxpayer about £120 million a year. But it's sitting there absolutely empty, and they're now trying to figure out, can they use it as a youth club or something like that. The single biggest PFI project in the whole of the north is the Southwest Acute Hospital, otherwise known as Enniskillen Hospital. And that hospital only opened actually in 2010, 2011. But it was actually started, the whole process of building it, and building it as a PFI hospital, started under Barbara de Bruin, the one and only health minister that Sinn Féin ever had, because after that it went other places. And that hospital originally was supposed to cost 224 million to build. It's like a really fancy hospital with it's all single room, single ensuite rooms. It's kind of built almost to be a private hospital actually. And sure enough, one of the wards, no sooner had it opened, but it was announced that one of the wards was being dedicated to a private, for private patients. But actually now they've discovered that the actual cost of it is going to be about 3 times what it was originally going to be. And in the end, by the time that they paid the 30-year contract to the Northern Ireland Health Group, and the Northern Ireland Health Group is the kind of private body that's involved in the hospital, in the PFI in the hospital, it's going to cost over 700 million. So like literally more than 3 times what it would have cost. And overall, over the next 25, 30 years, 7.3 billion pounds will be paid out of the public purse in the north to pay for PFI projects. The vast majority of which were initiated by Sinn Féin ministers. So that's just a start, right, to kind of set the scene in a way, because I think it's really important for people to understand that the whole basis of the Sinn Féin involvement in government in the north has been an acceptance of neoliberal policies, and not just not a kind of any kind of grudging implementation of those policies, but actually an enthusiastic implementation of those policies, right up until, because I can see people going, well, but what about all this crisis? Right up until March of this year, when we had the public sector one-day public sector strike, which was looking like it might actually get bigger and kind of snowball into something better. Now, I've not got a particular interest in welfare reform. As a matter of fact, I'm kind of seen as an expert on welfare reform because I teach it and I do research and stuff like that on welfare reform. So whenever I hear Sinn Féin people saying, well, you know, we cannot implement welfare reform, this is a step too far, this is why the government is in crisis now in the north, etc. I was going to say I laugh, but I don't. I actually kind of go, I groan and feel like crying, because they really had no problem at all with welfare reform, like I say, up until March of this year. And if you want proof of that, looking at 2008, the Welfare Reform Act of 2008 is actually the act that really impoverished people who are on benefits in Northern Ireland far more, apart from disabled people, far more than what the current proposals are going to do. Because the 2008 Reform Act in the North, Welfare Reform Act in the North, is actually the same as this, like the equivalent of the 2007 one in Britain. And it is the act that brought in, got rid of incapacity benefit, brought in the hated employment and support allowance. So any of you who watch Newsnight or Channel 4 News or anything will know about this awful thing called the work capability assessment, which is this assessment by which anybody who's like on the sick and has to go through if they want to get benefits across Britain and Northern Ireland. And this work capability assessment is the one that you'll have heard of people being found fit to work and then dying a couple of days later. That work capability assessment came in to the North in 2008 in this Welfare Reform Act. The Welfare Reform Act of 2008 also brought in a form of the bedroom tax for people in the private rented sector. So there's already been like a bedroom tax for people, for claimants in the private rented sector since 2008. And it also brought in a sanctioning regime that means that people can get cut, their benefits can be cut if they turn up late for an interview, if they don't make it to sign on, etc., that they can actually have their benefits cut for 3 weeks, 3 months, or even 6 months. And it also brought in this bringing down the age of the youngest child at which lone parents had to start looking for work, brought it down to 7. So this all happened in 2008. Now, we know the protracted negotiations that there have been about the Welfare Reform Act, the 2012 Welfare Reform Act, which still hasn't gone through in the Assembly. What an awful lot of people don't know is that that 2008 Welfare Reform Act went through the Assembly, the entire thing, first reading, committee stages, second reading, final reading, in 1 day. It got what they called accelerated passage, which is where the parties all agree that there's nothing controversial here, we can just pass it. So it's like whole thing through in 1 day. And that had an absolutely dreadful effect, particularly on lone parents, because most lone parents, the vast majority of lone parents, are actually renting, and their housing is through private rented sector. So this was cut to only give people enough money for rents in the bottom third of rents. Now that of course means that what lone parents now in the North have to do since 2008 is to find 20 or 30 pounds a week from the benefits that are supposed to put food in their children's mouths to supplement their housing benefit. And it's actually had a dreadful effect altogether on people's ability to heat their houses and to feed their kids as well. That was the 2008 Welfare Reform Act. Then in 2012, I'm sorry, I'm going to just talk a little bit about welfare reform because this is the thing that's being trumpeted as they're going to stop it, you know. So it's really important that you understand what's really happening. No, I haven't said that. I'm like delighted that they're stopping what's coming in now, and we'll come to that in a wee minute. But in 2012, there was another kind of change in Britain in terms of some of the stuff that the Tories wanted to bring in. And in Britain they brought in new regulations for job seekers, which would mean that basically they're bringing in workfare. They're bringing in this, you had to work for your dough. Again, that went through the Assembly pretty much without a comment, pretty much without any kind of comment. And in fact, the Social Development Committee, which is the committee, the Assembly committee that looks after benefits, which is chaired by Alex Maskey, and was chaired by Alex Maskey still back then, endorsed the introduction of workfare. They're called the Job Seekers Allowance brackets Work Experience brackets Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2012, passed unanimously by the Social Development Committee with a Sinn Féin chair. So, you know, the idea that welfare reform is something that they're ideologically against and have always tried to prevent is just a load of nonsense. Like I said, anybody would have to agree that it's great that they're opposing the current load of welfare reforms, because the ones that they're trying to bring in now are going to cut benefits to disabled people absolutely dreadfully. And it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the talks. I mean, everybody knows we're going to get them. We're going to get this welfare reform. It's just a question of how it's going to be tickied up to look a wee bit better. But to go back to the first mandate, because I think that in a way the first like assembly that there was after the Belfast Agreement, I think it's good to do that, to go back to before they were actually like the second largest party, because then you can see where they weren't under the same kind of pressure. So like the UUP ministers, the SDLP ministers who are in the position now that Sinn Féin were before 2007, they're able to rebel. They're able to say, no, we're not going to do that. They're able to, you know, there's not the same kind of pressure on them to kind of go along with whatever the DUP are doing. So when you look back to then, when you look back to before 2007, you are looking back to a time when really Sinn Féin was showing its absolute true colours in government. And I think that more than anybody else, a guy called Conor Murphy, and remember the name Conor Murphy because there's a good chance that whenever Gerry Adams finally retires, that it won't be Mary Lou MacDonald who'll be taken over from Gerry Adams, but it'll be possibly Conor Murphy. He was certainly being groomed for that until the bit of controversy, which we'll maybe talk, if we get time, we'll talk about later, when he was accused of discriminating, when he was actually found guilty actually of discriminating against somebody on sectarian grounds for a job, and after that he kind of, you know, he kind of fell out of favour for a while. But he used to be the Minister for Regional Development, and as the Minister for Regional Development he was in charge of two very important things: water and public transport. Now, when he came in 2007 as the Minister in 2007, he was actually he came in to an executive that had agreed that it wasn't going to introduce water charges. In the run-up to the election in 2000 was the election 2006 or 2007? 2007. In the run-up to the election in 2007, there had been a really vibrant campaign against water charges, very much like the campaign down here, calling for a boycott of a payment payment boycott. Thousands of people across the north saying that they weren't going to pay. Anti-water charges groups in almost every single community, Catholic and Protestant, every single working class community rather, Catholic and Protestant, and a really like quite determined population that was saying we won't pay. You can bring in the water charges, but you may forget that you're ever going to implement them because we are not going to pay them. And literally in the, we were standing in the election, Eamon was standing in the election in Derry, and you know, we had, all of our literature was, you know, we are the anti-water charges people. You know, the main parties are bringing in water charges, we are the anti-water charges people. And I kid you not, the election was called, the DUP and Sinn Féin were both, officially speaking, going to bring in water charges. And the minute the election was called, the next thing you know, there's a leaflet comes around the door, Sinn Féin, we're actually against water charges. And the week after that, a pamphlet comes around the door from the DUP. The DUP is against water charges. So all of a sudden, all of the parties which had been for water charges, now there's an election, were against it. Now before that election happened, the direct rule people, the British direct rulers, had already set up what they call a GOCO, a government company, to run the water, called Northern Ireland Water, which was due to you know, bring in the water charges. When the executive was set up and the executive returned from suspension, and Conor Murphy became the minister in charge of regional development, he not only did nothing to bring Northern Ireland Water back into the public sector and therefore make sure that it couldn't possibly be privatised, but he actually continued to prepare for water charges, including installing water meters in all new homes. And we actually discovered just last year that the installation of water meters in all new homes was continuing right up until last year, even though there'd been a Sinn Féin minister in charge of you know, of water up until the last election, that was 2011. At the same time, as he was doing nothing about making sure that water couldn't be privatised, Conor Murphy was actually actively making sure that our public transport could be privatised. The Transport Act of 2011, for the first time, I mean, actually Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK that still has a public transport system that's in public hands. It's never been privatised, partly because while the Troubles were on, nobody would have wanted to buy it, since buses got burnt a lot and trains got, got blown up and things like that. So really, it had been protected from the worst of Thatcherism and at the time when everything else was being privatised across the water. And yet, Conor Murphy, without any, I mean, I know where the pressure on him to do it was coming from. It was coming from the CBI, the bosses, the business people, the roads lobby, the private transport sector itself. They were putting a lot of pressure on him to open up transport in Northern Ireland from being entirely public transport into allowing the market to operate. And sure enough, in 2011 he brought in the Transport Act, which has opened up public transport in the north to the private sector. The aim of the Act, in its kind of preamble, actually says, quote, that it aims to, quote, open the market to controlled competition with new contracting and permit issuing powers. And it actually gave private companies the right to use facilities in like stations and bus stops and stuff, which were once the preserve of the of the public sector. So if you go into, for example, Derry's bus station today, or any of the bus stations across the north, you'll see private buses using the same stands as Translink buses, as public sector buses do. And that's because, as a result of Conor Murphy's sort of opening it up to privatisation. And in fact, that same Act also had in it a clause that said that if Belfast is to develop a rapid transport system, which has been promised now for decades, that would have to be open to competitive tendering. So, like, straight off, it was just, forget about public transport. Bring in, let the market dictate. And actually, I think that Conor Murphy is probably an example of your Sinn Féin politician par excellence, because I'm kind of, in a way, he kind of represents all that is worst about Sinn Féin in government, because not only has he been an enthusiastic implementer of neoliberal policies, but he's also been involved in some of the worst cronyism that we've seen. And I'll tell you this much, right? I don't know, do you watch the Irish Pictorial Weekly? Oh, they do that thing about that's Fianna Fáilness. You know that? Have you seen that? Does anybody know that? No? Or they have this great skit where they talk about like real, scams that your Fianna Fáil politicians would be involved in, and so things like Northern Ireland Water, some of the other places that I'm trying to think of other boards that he had, that he could appoint people to. A very small group of people, all of whom were business people, nearly all of them business men, as opposed to business women, for all the talk of the equality agenda, and overwhelmingly Catholic, in fact entirely Catholic. And to the extent that it was beginning to be embarrassing, it was to the extent that the newspapers were starting to comment on what a small pool of people were being appointed to these various quangos and things. And it got to the stage where actually, in relation to Northern Ireland Water, one of the people who had applied to be on the board of Northern Ireland Water and hadn't been appointed, actually challenged and said, no, this was sectarian. And like I say, it was actually found that was the case. Very briefly, there's also, if you look at some of our highest legal people in Northern Ireland, Barry McGrory, who's the Director of Public Prosecutions, John Larkin, who's the Attorney General, they're all people who have had links to Sinn Féin, have represented Sinn Féin politicians at different times and all, but somehow or other are also right-wing enough for the DUP to be happy with, and they're the kind of people who've been getting those kind of positions. I mean, I in terms of cronyism, I could actually go on forever, and we may talk about it afterwards. But I mean, if you take the Casement Park debacle, for example, I'm sure some of you know about that. Do you? If you don't know about Casement Park, okay. Well, basically, there's to be a big development of Casement Park, which is the main GAA stadium in West Belfast. Matt or any of the Belfast comrades could say more about it, but right from the beginning the residents were very worried about the place. They were very worried about it because it's in the middle of like a really crowded residential area, and I'll not go into it now, but it turns out that basically the arts minister, who's the person who'd be funding the whole thing, who's Sinn Fein minister, has not only, like, again, grasped that whole kind of neoliberal view of things, because this new Casement Stadium, even though it's in the middle of one of the poorest parts of Northern Ireland, is going to have all these executive boxes where, you know, you have to pay, I don't know, £1,000 a ticket or something to come in. It's going to have all of the same kind of crap as you have in the Aviva Stadium, that's, you know, looking for corporate, to look after the big corporations and everything. But it was actually so dangerous. The plans for the stadium were so dangerous that actually the safety people were saying that it risked another Hillsborough. And yet they were pushing ahead with it. And again, that kind of pushing ahead with it really comes back to cronyism. I'm probably not going to have time, because he's telling me that I need to hurry up to talk about what's going on in terms of social control with community groups. But we may want to talk about that in discussion. But it's actually the case in the north, in both the Catholic and in Protestant areas, that there is no longer an independent community development movement. The community groups are entirely controlled by political parties. Entirely controlled by political parties. You can't get a job unless you're very lucky. You can't get a job unless you've got the backing of one of the well, in Catholic areas, unless you've got the backing of one of the main parties, usually Sinn Féin. Now, the impact of that on, I mean, I really get very angry when I'm down here talking about the equality agenda and how they're progressing the equality agenda. Because one of the things that we've seen happening in the north over the last 5 or 6 years is funding for women's organisations just disappearing altogether. Absolutely, the independent women's sector is gone almost entirely. There's 2 or 3 large organisations, like at the very top, and apart from that, all the local women's groups are gone altogether. We don't have a proper gender strategy for Northern Ireland. In fact, the gender strategy that they brought out was so bad that, like, everybody rejected it. It didn't. Its idea of gender equality was to say that we had to make sure that if women got a halfpenny, men would get a halfpenny as well. Absolutely not recognising the oppression of women in our society. Supposed to be a gender strategy, but never mentioned it, has no LGBT issues in it. Doesn't mention trans people at all. Didn't mention. I mean, it's so bad that everybody just sort of said, "Take it away. We'll have nothing to do with it." But at least they did issue a draft gender strategy. They have failed to issue a sexual orientation strategy. They just can't agree on one. I mean, actually, it's not only can they not agree on one, but they can't even get started on one. And when we come to the cuts that are going on at the minute, in terms of a full 10% of our public sector workers being cut, their jobs being cut. Now think about that, 1 in every 10 public sector workers. That's not 1 in every 10 civil servants, because they like to present it as being just civil servants losing their jobs, and everybody thinks, oh well, they're all pen pushers, who cares about them? But actually, it's when we're talking about the public sector workers, we're talking about nurses, we're talking about doctors, we're talking about teachers, we're talking about classroom assistants, we're talking about people who sweep the roads, we're talking about people who cut the hedges on the side of the road, we're talking, I mean, again, when you challenge them on it, when you say you're cutting 20,000 public sector workers and you say that you're not for austerity, they say, oh, but hang on a second, those people will walk straight into other jobs. They're getting nice big fat paychecks and they're walking straight into other jobs because they've got all these skills. They try to present it as that all the people who are going are all these like top mandarins. Well, we have friends who work in the Dole office They work, I mean, they paid 15 grand a year, 17 grand a year if they're lucky, right? And working in the local dole offices, and they're being put under pressure to take the package and go. They're being put under pressure because they've been told, like, oh, you have two years pay, and you can get this 2 years pay all at once, and they're thinking, I could get 30 grand all at once and it'd be tax-free, and wouldn't that be great? And I'm kind of going to them, you're 47 years old, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? You know, there's no other jobs around. So what are you going to do? Go and work in a call centre, which is all the options that there'd be. I mean, dreadful and a complete ignoring of the fact that it's already the case that there aren't enough jobs in the north. So I'm going to be, he's going to tell me soon to shut up, but I just really want to have a little rant about the lack of jobs, right? And because on the one hand there's all this welfare reform stuff that has been brought in. They're getting rid of 20,000 public sector jobs and paying and borrowing all this money to pay people off on 2 years' wages as redundancy money. And at the same time, for every 100 people of working age in the north of Ireland, there's only 71 jobs. That's 10 jobs per 100 people of working age less than there would be in Britain. So we've already got like an awful lot more people unemployed who are never going to be able to work. See around where we live in the northwest, in Strabane there's fewer than 50 jobs for every 100 people of working age. In Limavady, and just to let you know, right, because Strabane's a very Catholic area, but Limavady's a very Protestant area, so in case anybody thinks that it's just totally sectarian, in Limavady there's only 46 jobs for every 100 people of working age. So what that's saying is that, you know, on the one hand, you have to look for, under all this welfare reform stuff, going back to 2008, which is when it all really started coming in, you know, you have to show that you're looking for you've applied for so many jobs every week and all that kind of thing, and there's absolutely, there are no jobs there to apply for. Instead, what's happening, and I was actually talking to a fellow, I went into Poundland yesterday to buy some glasses because I left my glasses at home, and the young fellow behind the counter, you know, he's been really friendly and everything, and I said to him, I said, you obviously enjoy working here. He says, no, he says, I don't, but I have, you know, since I have no choice, and I said, are you actually getting paid? Because I knew that there was a whole lot of people on work fair. He's gone, no, it's work fair. So like, Poundland, do you know what I mean? Like, so you kind of wonder, how do Poundland manage to sell glasses at £1 a pair? Well, they do it because they're not having to pay their workers, because most of them are on work fair, and they will work there for 3 months, and then they leave, and another bunch of work fair people come on. And of course, you don't actually need an awful lot of training to work in, you know, behind a till like that. I've done it myself. So it just, yeah, okay. So the last couple of things I wanted to talk about is I wanted to say something nice, because I think that after, you know, like having such a go on the economic stuff, that I should say something good and about Sinn Féin government. And in fairness, in relation to the abortion issue, Sinn Féin in government in the north has actually twice stopped the DUP bringing in a motion that would actually effectively close the Mary Stokes Clinic in Belfast. And that's something that, you know, we really have to acknowledge, that they brought in a petition of concern, which meant that the DUP couldn't push through this ridiculous notion of sort of saying that the only abortions in Northern Ireland should be on the NHS, when of course you can't get an abortion on the NHS. And like I say, twice Sinn Féin brought in petitions of concern and stopped them doing them. Having said that, there is a real problem with their approach to abortion, and in fact their approach to abortion in the north is probably even more like less pro-choice than it is down here. So they talk only about the good, what they, you know, the kind of good abortions, and actually the law in the north is fairly clear that it allows abortion when women's health is in danger, not only when our lives are in danger, but also when our health is in danger. And yet when they talk about it in the assembly, they always talk about, we don't want any Savita Halapanovars here, we have to protect women's lives. So they're really bringing it down to the lowest possible common denominator, protecting women's lives, as opposed to their health, although the law allows us to protect our health, and talking about fetal abnormalities, rather than, you know, kind of wider issues. And then there's no attempt at all at agitating for guidelines. So we know, for example, like I said, that abortion is legal in much wider circumstances in the north than it is down here. And we've been waiting now for quite some time for the Minister for Health to bring in guidance. But really, Sinn Féin have been very happy to just not harass the DUP about that, but to leave it to the courts instead. And it's the same actually with equal marriage, even though again they've been very good on equal marriage and bringing forward votes in the Assembly, etc., to show the level of support that there is in the north for equal marriage. At the same time, they seem to be quite happy to actually leave it to the courts rather than to harass the DUP about it.
The floor, and we're going to have about 15 or 20 minutes for people to speak. We would encourage people to try and keep their contributions to about 2 or 3 minutes, please. There's a break after this meeting, but I'm assuming people want their lunch hour. And if anybody wants to speak, just raise their hand, because we don't want people talking over one another. Melissa, yeah?
Yeah, just thanks, Goretti, for that. I think it's having the actual facts of what Sinn Féin do in government is really important for us in the south, because they are very adept at denying it. So if you don't have the full facts, you get caught out very quickly, you know, like you said, but you implemented water charges in the north, and they go, no, 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 no. And then so having the actual facts, I think, is really important for any activist in the south at the moment. And I'd just like to give 2 examples of how we can see all of the exact things you're saying. We can already see them here, you know. On the council that myself and Carl sit on in John Leary, we have there's 3 of us and there's 3 in Sinn Féin. And there's 2 examples, I think, that show the cronyism and the desire for privatisation, or the willingness for privatisation that you can see. And first of all, in the county development plan, there was a motion, a very controversial motion, to rezone a parcel of land up in the mountains, up in the Dublin Mountains, for a nursing home. The land is currently worth about £5 as a piece of agricultural land. It's worth nothing. One man owns it, who's in cahoots with Dennis O'Brien in the Beacon Clinic. One man owns it. The motion was to rezone the land, which would turn it into being absolutely worth a fortune to develop a private nursing home. And it came up in February, and the majority of people voted against it, including Sinn Féin. It comes up again in October because there's 2 phases to it, and Sinn Féin stand up to say how very conflicted they are about this, and that while a private nursing home really isn't, but that they were actually going to vote for it this time. Now, in the story's too long and I'm not going to go into it, but because we stood up and had a right go at them and a right go at, and the way it turned out, that the whole thing ended in a kerfuffle, and they abstained in the end, right? But their inclination, and if they're not challenged from the left, they will just go whooshing down that slide into exactly what you say, what the Labour Party are in government. And the second thing is a very important battle over the privatisation of the harbour in Dún Laoghaire, a very important culturally, historically, it's a public amenity, and there is a battle at the moment for that to be privatised. There was a motion last week that we would make a commitment as councillors that we didn't want to see it privatised. And of course the right wing put up their arguments, well, we don't know the finances of it, can we say that when we just haven't a clue? And Sinn Féin get up and make an argument that until we can find out whether or not it's profitable, this is a public amenity, until we can find out whether or not it's profitable, we couldn't possibly vote for this. Now the candidate, the Sinn Féin candidate, happened to be out of the room for the vote, so he can't be found to be either way, while the other 2 happily voted for it. So we can see all the things you say down here in the south, but you can only see it if you're very close up to them, which we are in the council. And the vast majority, or there's lots and lots of people out there who are going, well, they're not the same down here, they're a bit different down here, when you make those arguments. And I think that it's a tricky business, being able to relate to those people who want to see all of us working together, and sure, you're all on the same side, and what are you doing having a go at each other? It's quite, and being able to have that balance right of saying, of course we work together on all the things we agree with, but we're a bit wary because the evidence is there, not only in the north, but already here in the south. Thanks.
Charles first. Jeff from Australia. Great talk. You've exposed the contradiction that Sinn Fein has in the election period. So they talk out of that side of the mouth, and then after the elections they actually implement something else. And that kind of contradiction then means to me that it has to have some reflection in the people who do work for them. So the leadership are doing this, they're implementing this, they're saying this and then implementing that. But the membership, the supporters, the people who are honest reformists would be saying, well, what the fuck? So do you have some evidence that there's a discussion, there's a left wing forming in Sinn Fein? Please.
Okay. Well, Greg's going to come back at the end, so people can maybe take these up as well. Breed.
The point Greg finished on comparing Sinn Féin to the Labour Party, I think is really important, because it's not just about the characters, you know, that are involved. You know, Pat Rabbitte looks a bit like, you know, Mary Lou sometimes in their rhetoric and all the rest of it, but it's more about what that means politically, where they situate themselves on the political spectrum. And as Melissa pointed out there, and I could go through loads of examples as well, in the City Council, where Sinn Féin are actually part of the ruling group, they made it, because they're the biggest group in the council, they made a pact with Labour, Greens and some independents to be the ruling group in the council, so they're right up management's backside most of the time. But my point being that the comparison with the Labour Party is about the question of where you situate yourself in terms of the political spectrum, and how you see both the economic and the political system in relation to you and your class. And Sinn Féin clearly see themselves as managers of the system. Here's a system, capitalism, they will say to you, it has its problems, it's unfair, there's inequalities, and we'll be the great champions of inequality, but we'll manage that inequality, and we'll manage that economy, and we'll manage that system on behalf of the capitalists. And they do it very, very eloquently in the council chambers, where, as Melissa pointed out, it's hard to catch up with them with their lies. But it's incredible to be up close and see how they can barefaced lie and get away with it, because they put a veneer on it, and they have a great machine. Immediately they're out in their constituency with a leaflet that denies this, that and the other. But we're discovering a little trick that helps to sow the seeds of doubt in people's minds correctly, not because we're being malevolent about it, but because we can see that there's huge doubts there. And what we do is we grab the clips of serious debates and put them on YouTube or on Facebook and say to people, look, this is what actually happened, where you have Sinn Féin councillors arguing one thing and putting out leaflets about another, and making public statements about another. But at the end of the day, managing the whole system on behalf of the managers, the CEOs and the managers and the system itself. So I think it's a really important comparison, because that is exactly what the Labour Party do. So we're going through a process at the moment. We're on a journey, we really are, with the working class down here, because Sinn Féin's popularity comes down a bit and spikes and comes down a bit, and that's going to happen between now and the general election. And the comparisons with the North are the ones that we've got to keep an eye on. But we've also got to know that the population down here think they're brilliant. And, you know, I'd be fairly impressed with your man from Donegal, you know, what's his name? Yeah, Pierce Doherty, when he gives it loads about the bankers and the corruption and all the rest of it. And you would be fairly impressed with a lot of them when they speak and represent the raw anger and the raw abhorrence that people feel towards this government and the system and all the rest of it. So they're capturing that radical element of Irish society, and they're running with it because they look like serious operators that have a serious chance of winning. And our class is running with them, believing in them, but they've got to go through the process of learning that these are the ones, they're like the Pat Rabbittes that say to you, Asher, you do that in elections, don't you? But in reality, we want to manage a chaotic, rotten, unequal system on behalf of the bosses and the capitalists out there, and that is what they do. The other thing to say that I've really noticed, because I come from a Republican background, and a lot of the characters involved, I would have known when I was a kid, you know, there would have been IRA operators, and they're now like parliamentarians in councils. And when an issue comes up that requires them all to batten together and batten down the hatches and really push through the budget and have good speeches about why they should push through the budget, they have their what used to be the commanding officer of the IRA in the Dublin Brigade sitting in the gallery and having side meetings with them. So, like, you know, when they talk about in the North that the IRA still exists, I feckin' see it. It's not that they're going around with Armalites in their back pocket, but their structures and their discipline is still very, very tight. And it's very interesting to see that. At the same time, however, I do have to say that there among their elected representatives, there are some very decent, very committed socialists that, you know, that do want a different kind of society. They probably haven't thought out as much as, say, we do in the SWP. What do we mean by socialism? What do we mean by revolution? But they certainly do want to challenge the status quo. And I would hope that, you know, when we say about the left pushing them, it's not even the left pushing them to the left, it's often the working class. The water charges movement was not just the left, it was the working class and the rural communities that pushed Sinn Féin into saying, oh, I'm not paying. I was going to pay, but now I'm not. You know, one after another, Mary Lou, Jerry Adams, the whole lot of them had said they would pay, they'd be good boys and girls, and then all of a sudden they weren't paying. Not because Breed Smith or Richard Boy Barrett stood up, but because there was tens of thousands of people out in every town and village saying, no way, we won't pay and this is wrong. And so the people push them to the left and put manners on them every so often, but I have no doubt that they will try and sell out those same people. I have absolutely no doubt about it. And the one thing that really convinces me of it is the lack of their refusal to say categorically that they will not go into coalition with the right-wing parties, with the establishment. They will not say that, and particularly about Fianna Fáil, who would be their sort of bedfellow Republican Party allies. And lastly, just to say on the question of the right to change and our signing up to it, we didn't agree to an election pact with Sinn Féin. The question we were asked was, how would we work together with other parties to make this change happen? And we agreed that anybody who's endorsed by the Right to Change movement should transfer to each other. So in my area, I'd transfer to Joan Collins or I'd transfer to Angus Snoddy. Actually, I'd probably transfer to Angus Snoddy anyway, because of all of the rotten lot that are out there, who would you say to vote for? You certainly are not going to encourage people, after what we've been through, to vote for Labour. What's the point in voting?
We may win this campaign or whatever, but I'll tell you what, if I become Minister of Finance, I'll get rid of the water charges. And our People Before Profit representative spoke next, and he just said, I won't be waiting for anybody to be elected, like, we can do it, we can win this or whatever. You know, the typical point that a socialist would make. But a very well-known Sinn Féin person came to me afterwards, like, and was basically saying, rein in your guy. You know, and said, we own Cabra. And I think it's really important because it's an obvious indicator of people's attitude to the working class and to people's participation and people power. And Sinn Féin is obviously, you know, is being pushed to the left by the movement and wants to, you know, harness that and essentially own that movement. And it made me connect to what you were saying about social control in communities and so on. You know, and this idea, we own these people. And I see it similarly in the inner city in terms of community work. Like, I've seen it at things like voter education, where the Sinn Féin guys come in, they're almost like military, you know, they're in the bomber jackets and all, and a posse of them, like, and kind of really take over the debate, if you like, and sort of shout people down and stuff like that. Like, and yeah, I just, it was really important to understand that they want to, if you like, rule the movement and rule and manage, as you were saying, manage capitalism on behalf, rather than have people's participation from the bottom.
Okay, thanks. This is Sinn Féin is a nationalist party. It is not a socialist party. It may well be that there are people in Sinn Féin who say, I've joined as a socialist, I really want to see as socialist and so forth. They're in a nationalist party. And I think a new quarter should be given to the notion that Sinn Féin can be pushed into a socialist position, will develop into a socialist position, or anything else. Why does Sinn Féin say we own Cabra? Because they believe they have an entitlement as the national movement, as the leaders of the national movement, to Cabra or anywhere else. That is why when you see anywhere where Sinn Féin gets a little bit of status or roots in a group, they will approach that community, not in the way people on the left would do it, arguing and seeking the support of the community. They claim the allegiance of the community. You will see this in their language and their rhetoric and their behaviour and all the rest of it. It is not the case that there's people sort of who used to be high in the IRA who are still turning up, sort of instructing or advising members of it. They are the IRA. The IRA does run Sinn Fein. That's the fact of the matter. Sinn Fein is a nationalist party with a militaristic leadership. When it comes to what are the implications of this, incidentally, you talk about will Sinn Fein join a government which goes and privatises things, which is anti-working class. Of course it will. Of course it will. The key element for Sinn Féin in any negotiation about going into government with Fianna Fáil will be, does this advance the national cause? Does this lead us closer? If the constitutional issues are much more important to Sinn Féin than class issues, any nationalist movement anywhere in the world can turn a left face to the electorate and a right face to the electorate because they purport to and attempt to represent all classes within the nation. That is why they can be had dinners sort of with millionaires and all the rest of it and people who won't recognise unions and then associate themselves with radical working class movements. All nationalist parties do that. They seek to encompass the whole nation. And if we get that clear in our minds at the start, we will better understand what is actually happening and we'll better understand the people who are on the left and who are promoting Sinn Féin. The main party promoting Sinn Féin as a leftist party and giving them credentials at the moment, north and south, is the Communist Party of Ireland. It is their most important perspective. And that's in line with what they've always been saying. The whole idea of the stages theory of revolution, which was developed by Stalinism in the 1930s and all the rest of it. But first you solve national questions, then you move on to talk about the class structures that you want in the free nation. That's what's going on, and it should be said straight out. It should be said in simple, straightforward terms. That is a nationalist party. It is not a socialist party. If you're a socialist, what the hell are you doing in a sort of a nationalist party with such a sordid, vicious history of sectarian violence and cruelty north and south? We're far too small. One of the reasons that Sinn Féin is getting away with this, I'm not saying our party, the left in general has been timid to a fault in its approach to Sinn Féin, and that should stop.
Okay, here's Clark. Main things that the Shinners will say when faced with criticism about their history of governance in the north, and most importantly recent history in austerity and privatisation and everything else. They'll say that their hands are tied and that they can't do anything, that this is to do with the powers of Stormont in relationship to the powers of Westminster. And to me it sounds quite similar to what we heard before with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and Labour in relation to the Troika. They said their hands are tied, they can't really do anything. I mean, we heard from the Troika themselves that they had choices. They didn't have to introduce the water charge, didn't have to introduce the property tax. They could have been, other proposals could have come to the table that the government at the time didn't bring to the table. It's just not something I know in relation to Stormont and Westminster. What can, short of expecting the Shinners to all of a sudden become revolutionary socialists and ask for the collapse of Stormont, what can they actually do that they're not doing within the powers that they have? Okay, thanks very much. Just before Grady comes back, I think I can make a couple of points. Grady gives a dominant account of the kind of north generally. If you put Jerry Carroll in here, you could give a dominant account of the last year in Belfast City Hall and how Sinn Féin have kind of tried to straddle that, and kind of being forced to shift from the left and all the rest of it. And I think it is right to say very clearly that Sinn Féin have a reformist strategy in the state. I mean, when Sinn Féin's strategy is put in its best way, it was actually put in its best way last year here by Owen O'Brien. Yes. I mean, he's the best left voice of Sinn Féin, which is problematic in itself because that's not the line of the party often. But even taking at face value, say it was the line of the party, that you can go in and transform the state and work it on your behalf and all the rest of it. The proof's in the pudding up north. It doesn't work. I mean, they say they're not. Say they're against the coalition government, they don't go into the coalition government in the south and all the rest of it. Up north they're in a coalition government with some of the biggest reactionaries in probably European terms, And actually I think that's right to say, well actually the Labour Party, because what Sinn Féin do in government is what every austerity implementing government does across Europe. It blames it on forces outside of their control. It's not us, it's the Tories, it's not us, it's the IMF, etc, etc. And actually, so their strategy is similar. But having said that, I think it's also important to understand in terms of how Sinn Féin shifts, and how Sinn Féin changes, it does have a different history from the Labour Party, and it does have a different history from traditional reformist movements. And I think, of course, again, the stuff about the IRA controlling Sinn Féin, no more clear than in West Belfast, believe me. That's in that sense, it's the belly of the beast. And we should say very clearly that it's undemocratic, that there's all sorts of problems with it. But I do think we should also have some sense of saying, when we criticise Sinn Féin on them terms, we have to distance ourselves from the kind of liberal condemnation that we see from both the Tory government and the Southern State. I mean, there's a long history in Ireland of blaming the armed struggle and blaming the Troubles on the kind of hidden hand of republicanisms and all the rest of it. We have to say, no, actually that was a different context. The Troubles were a product of 2 sectarian states, and in doing that we can have an independent critique of republicanism which is separate from what we hear in the Southern media and from the Tories, and really begin to articulate a kind of actually a class difference between us and Sinn Féin, because that's the important point. There's a history of, I mean, we have a history of anti-partition in our party, and I mean, really looking at the South today, it would be a warning to look up north, to look what's coming with the rise of Sinn Féin in the South, and to raise that in every issue and in everything that we do about the record in government and how we can articulate a different role. Just hand the word to Grady then.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I'm actually going to start with the question of did they implement water charges in the north, because I think that you have to be clear that they actually didn't implement water charges in the north, but what they did do was they failed, even when they were in charge of it, to do what needs to be done down here, which is to get rid of Irish water, bring water back into public hands. They failed to do that. They failed to bring Northern Ireland water back into the public sector, and they allowed the continuation of the infrastructure to be put in place, which would allow the privatisation of water eventually and the bringing in of water charges. So it's not that they implemented them, because we still don't have water charges. They're still afraid of the mass movement, but they certainly did nothing to make sure that water charges could ever be brought in. And every year they still say, we have ensured that water charges aren't implemented. So like they're continuing, it's this hanging over us all the time that someday they will be implemented. But in the meantime we're getting this grace and favour, because of their fear of the movement. And actually, when you were talking about the privatisation of Dunleary Harbour and their attitude to that, it's the exact same as in Belfast Harbour. Belfast Harbour has been up for, in fact, part of the Stormont House agreement was that they would realise the assets, realise public assets. Now, what do you do when you realise your assets? You sell them. That's what it means. If you're going to realise your assets, it means you're going to sell them. So they've already agreed, as part of the Stormont House agreement, that now because when you say, you're going to sell off TransLink, you're going to sell off Belfast Harbour, and that, they say, we've never said that. Well, no, they haven't said it, but the Stormont House agreement says they'll realise their assets, and that means, we all know that's what that means. I actually, in terms of what Breed was saying about the trickiness of working with them when they're sort of doing the right thing, I mean, we have that in the north as well, because obviously at the moment we have to sort of be on the same side as them in terms of standing up against welfare reform, while attacking them for getting rid of all the public sector workers. You know what I mean? So there is that kind of tricking. But the difference between the north and the south is that because they are in government in the north, and they are clearly implementing austerity in the north, even when they're pretending not to, that actually the idea, the response from any of our supporters in the north, when there was the talk about any agreement at all to transfer to Sinn Féin down here, was just like, why would we vote in the north for people who support in any way an anti-austerity party down here? And it was actually quite, wasn't it? It was like, to be honest with you, the response was like incredibly bad. So while we do understand, while those of us in the north do understand, the approach of the working class in the south to Sinn Féin, and that is seen as being left-wing, etc. In the north, nobody, absolutely nobody, not even Sinn Féin people themselves would describe themselves as left-wing. Well, they do now, this last couple of months, but up until the last couple of months, up until the March the 13th strike, basically, up until the March the 13th strike was announced, there wasn't a Shinner in the north would have called themselves left-wing, apart from the occasional one, but very, very, very occasional one. And then after that, things changed very much. Now the question that was asked about from here is like, is there a left wing developing within Sinn Féin? That's actually really interesting, because it seems like it's almost like there are two different parties, North and South, because the Ardèche this year, their annual conference, was in Derry. And some of us were protesting outside, pro-choice people were protesting outside of the Ardèche on the night that it opened, because remember they had just abstained in the Dáil on the fetal abnormalities vote. So we were protesting, saying, you know, stop abstaining on women's rights, women's right to choose. And the number of young people that came up to us, delegates, and said, we're going in there to argue for a woman's right to choose, and we're socialists, and we're pro-choice, and we're on the same side as you, and wait till you see, you know, things are changing, and we'll bring them around and all that. And then, of course, what happened, actually in the Ardèche, was that there was a motion that said that they should support the right of women to have abortions if they're diagnosed with a fetal abnormality. And then through some trickery, some procedural trickery, they weren't even allowed to vote on the main pro-choice motions. And again that happened the whole way through the Ardèche, that the young definitely left-wing people from the south were just not allowed to pass anything that actually might commit them to something else, to a more left-wing position. And I think that actually you can actually what people were sort of saying about the way that the Sinn Féin down here don't want to see any people power. I think that really is, that's how they operate within the organisation as well. We will not allow anything independent to grow, basically. And we really saw that during the water charges movement in the north. And I don't know if you've had this down here as well, but quite literally, we would organise. It was easier for us to organise in Protestant working class areas against the water charges than it was to organise in the Catholic working class areas. So that's not the way it is normally. But the thing was that because we were trying to organise a non-payment campaign, we would organise a meeting in a Catholic working class area, and it would be swamped by Shinners. There would be, there'd be 10 people sitting there from the local community who wanted to organise a water chargers group, and 10 Shinners with half a dozen councillors and all among them would arrive in and literally wreck the meeting, just make sure that we wouldn't get a group organised, because they were absolutely determined that there'd be no independent movement of any kind, no idea at all of people participating themselves and making any changes to themselves. And that's actually really, that's why I don't think you see that you can call a party left-wing if it's not encouraging people themselves to take some kind of control over their own lives and try to take some kind of control over the movement that they're involved in. That's the essence, it would seem to me, of socialism. And I suppose a lot of that does come back to the whole question of the IRA actually, and the IRA structures. And to say that there are, when there was the whole discussion going on down here, but does the IRA still exist? Are the structures still there? We were all going I'm sure you were as well. Sure, of course it is. You can see it on the streets every day. Even in terms of community groups, right? And our local community group in the Bogside is based at a place called the Gas Yard. Well, there was a big row among the people in the Gas Yard the year before last, and where some of the, the manager was seen as being a bit of a bully, and some of the people who worked there, they're all Shinners, are related to Shinners, or the sons or daughters of prisoners and stuff like that, or hunger strikers or whatever. And the next thing we hear, it's all been sorted. How is it all sorted? The OC came in, and the OC told them all what was going to happen, and the manager who'd been a bully had to be moved. In fact, he was moved out of community work altogether. And the OC organised it all. And that was the end of it. It was all sorted, because they were all told what to do. And it's the same when it comes to elections. When it comes to elections, why do you think that they have the number of people out canvassing that they do, no matter how bad the weather is? If the weather is really bad, our folk are all phoning up and sort of saying, it's raining a lot, don't know, this is such a good day for canvassing. Wouldn't it be great to be able to say, under orders, out you go, no matter how wet it is. But that is actually, unfortunately, that's actually what happens. And in terms of, that is part of the legacy of the past. in terms of like army stuff, there's very little goes on at the moment in terms of IRA, so in terms of like military stuff. What I mean military stuff, I mean bang bang, you know, shooting stuff, there's very little goes on. But there is still that very clear legacy of the past in other ways. And I think that the whole way, the attitudes, for example, to money is an example of that. So we've had a scandal in Derry over this last wee while where the it turns out that the councillors, all the Sinn Féin councillors, have all been having their allowances funneled into a Sinn Féin bank account. And some of them were signing on, even though like their allowances would be about 14,500 a year, which in the north that's about £1,000 more than you'd get in a call centre, £1,000 a year more than you get in a call centre. So they shouldn't be signing on. So this poor young fellow, who I always felt sorry for actually, who's a counsellor, gets done by the fraud squad for having been signing on.
What is signing on?
When he's counsellor, huh? Signing on, sorry, getting the dole. And he'd been getting the dole, you know, being able to afford billboards and ads and, you know, in all the papers and ads on the TV and all that kind of thing. Sure, they have loads of money compared to, you know, the rest of us can't compete. Don't mind the £500 a play thing that Jerry Adams goes to over in the States twice a year or whatever, you know. Don't mind all the money that they get from donors, because that's the other thing. The election in the north, the way that election finances are organised for small parties like us is dreadful. So we got €100 of a donor, people for profit, got €100 donation anonymously, and like was just left under the office door. And we ended up having to give that money to the Electoral Commission because it was an anonymous donation, and therefore we had to give it back to them. We actually had to write the bloody cheque, right? And yet, you know, these huge parties, and I'm including the DUP as well as Sinn Féin in this, can get thousands and thousands of pounds in donations from large companies and everything, and they don't have to, you know, they don't seem to have to worry about it at all. But I want to finish on, because he's telling me to shut up, I want to finish on two things. First of all, are they good managers of capitalism, right? They say, you know, like when it comes down to it, if you look at the north, they aren't good managers of capitalism. They want to be good managers, they want to be managers of capitalism. But I'll tell you this much, you see, if you want a party that's going to manage capitalism, don't put Sinn Féin into government, because actually they have failed, haven't they, entirely in the north. And the question about are their hands tied goes to that. Because actually there's a huge amount of things that they could do in the north that would really make a difference to working class people, and they haven't done them. You only have to look at Scotland, which has a smaller subvention, you know, gets a smaller block grant proportionately than does the north. And yet in Scotland there's no student fees. In Scotland older people get free social care, whereas in the north they have to pay for it, and we have, you know, student fees nearly £4,000, £4,000. If you, in terms of the kind of things they can do, I mean, we talked about some of these in people before profit, but the rates in the north, which are the only method of tax raising that they have been frozen since 2006. They're capped at £400,000 the cost of your house. We have said again and again and again, and other people have said it as well, you could link rates, the amount of rates that are being paid, to ability to pay. And actually the middle classes in the north, and I'm including myself in this because I'm a university lecturer and therefore have a relatively decent job, the middle classes in the north pay about 20% less in a whole lot of charges and taxes and stuff than do the middle classes in Britain. And if you've got a middle class job, a relatively well-paid job in the north, you're on the pig's back. You really are, because actually you have an awful lot more disposable income than you would if you were in Britain. And yet there's been an absolute refusal to actually say, let's up the rates, let's link it to ability to pay, and let's actually bring some real money in here. But there's loads of other things as well that they could be doing in the meantime, and I mean, I can talk to you about some of them afterwards. But we have, in People for Profit, we've shown again and again how that could happen, and things like, for example, a programme of house building, going back to having social housing instead of sending everybody into private rented and all that as they are at the minute, and the impact that that would have on the whole economy. There's loads of things that they could do that they absolutely aren't doing. And just to finish off, because I think that actually, you know, you were Matt was a little bit, what's the word, like he wasn't blowing the trumpet of the West Belfast people, because I think we actually ought to finish off on the fact that when they say down here, right, we own Cabra, you say to me, you used to say that about West Belfast. They can't say it anymore about West Belfast. They can't say we own West Belfast anymore. Because when Jerry Carroll got 20% of the vote, that's saying they don't own West Belfast anymore. And that's actually really important, because it says that you can, through, you know, proper campaigning, through being consistent campaigning, that you can actually show them up. And I think that also, when we're talking about Sinn Féin down here, we need to be clear, and I forget who it was that said it, but I think it's really important, about why it is the difference between why we want a united Ireland and why we're anti-partition and why they're anti-partition. Because we have no romantic notions of the fourth green field, or, you know, that somehow or other that there's something special, you know, about this island or anything like that. It's because we want working class unity, because we want people power, because we want people to be able to feel their own power and not be divided as we are on this island between North and South, as well as between Catholic and Protestant. And I think that that is really, when it comes down to it, you know, when we are talking about what kind of a party Sinn Féin is, we should actually be, I mean, I talked about the Labour Party, but I mean, Eamon has a point when he says maybe we should be talking about Fianna Fáil. I think that's what he's getting at. We should be actually looking to Fianna Fáil more as what Sinn Féin is. Because we saw in the 1930s, when Fianna Fáil first came to power, they were all talking left. It didn't stop them hanging Republicans. It didn't stop them, you know, being the party that they are today. Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party, you know, and really what Sinn Féin is wanting to be is the new Fianna Fáil. And from that point of view, they certainly don't particularly care about working class unity, just in the same way as Fianna Fáil was quite happy to abandon the North. I'm not saying that they would abandon the North in the same way, but they are talking today about having a united Ireland where there would still be a devolved government in the North. That's not a united Ireland. That's not a united working class. That's a capitalist, you know, that's a capitalist federation. It is not a united Ireland, and it's not even the kind of Ireland where you could actually say there'd be any peace, because there won't be long term. There won't be peace if you still have a divided working class on the island. So I suppose, just to finish off, I'd sort of say, whatever you do, don't let them get into government here, because you'll really regret it, folks, if you do.
Okay, thanks very much. Just a couple of announcements.